First Contact's Folly. The Grand Assembly Hall of the Galactic Council gleamed with an almost painful perfection. Every surface had been engineered to mathematical precision, each angle calculated to inspire maximum awe in visiting species. High Counselor Zixtal stood before the curved assessment panel, their crystalline form refracting light in carefully controlled patterns meant to convey authority. Species Assessment Report 7249, Designation: Humans, Zixtal announced, their voice modulated to carry perfectly to every corner of the vast chamber. The preliminary findings are troubling. The assembled representatives of the Council's 100 most advanced civilizations shifted in their various forms of seeding. Discovery of a new spacefaring race always brought excitement, but the High Counselor's tone suggested something unprecedented. These humans, Zixtal continued, displaying a holographic image of Earth, achieved faster than light travel through what can only be described as a series of accidents and improvised solutions. Their mathematical models are inefficient. Their technology is unstandardized. And yet, the High Counselor paused, their crystalline structure flickering with puzzlement. And yet they are here. Dr. Sarah Chen stood alone on the presentation platform below, her simple blue suit a stark contrast to the ornate biomechanical garments of the Council members. As Earth's leading xenolinguist and the head of humanity's First Contact program, she had expected skepticism. The amused condescension in some of the alien faces, however, made her straighten her spine. The assessment board recommends immediate quarantine and supervision, Zixtal declared. Until humans can demonstrate proper understanding of galactic principles, they cannot be trusted with. Point of order, Sarah interrupted, her voice clear and steady. A collective gasp rippled through the chamber. No species had ever interrupted a High Counselor's assessment. Zixtal's crystalline form flashed deep red. You are not recognized, human. According to Article 7 of the Galactic Charter, which you transmitted to us upon first contact, any species under assessment has the right to challenge the method of evaluation. Sarah smiled, the expression both diplomatic and determined. We exercise that right. The chamber erupted in a cacophony of translated protests. Zixtal raised their upper appendages for silence. You wish to challenge the assessment board's methodology. Our testing protocols have been refined over 50,000 years. Precisely, Sarah replied. They've been refined to test species that developed along similar paths to your own. But humanity's path was different. We propose an alternative evaluation. A low murmur ran through the chamber. The representative from the Silicon Collective, a towering pillar of intelligent crystal similar to but less refined than Zixtal, leaned forward. What alternative could possibly be valid? Instead of testing us, Sarah said, let us teach you. The chamber fell silent. Then, gradually, the silence gave way to something humans had not yet heard from the Council. Laughter. It came in various forms. Crystalline chimes, subsonic rumbles, electromagnetic pulses of amusement. But its meaning was universal. Teach us. Zixtal's form sparkled with mirth. Your species still burns fossil fuels on some continents. What could you possibly teach the Galactic Council? Sarah withdrew a small device from her pocket. It was nothing impressive. A simple holographic projector cobbled together from Earth tech and reverse-engineered alien components. Let me introduce you to Professor James Okonjo of the University of Lagos. His field of study is failure. The hologram flickered to life, showing an elderly man with kind eyes and gray-streaked dreadlocks. His image smiled and waved at the Council. Hello, distinguished representatives. I'm a professor of engineering psychology, specializing in how humanity learns from its mistakes, and I have a question for this august body. When was the last time any of you failed at anything? The chamber grew quiet again, but differently this time. Sarah watched as the Council members shifted uncomfortably. Your civilizations are built on perfection, Professor Okonjo continued. Your AIs calculate every possibility. Your machines operate with quantum precision. Your societies advance along carefully plotted mathematical curves. His smile widened. But humanity, we stumble, we fall, we fail spectacularly. And then we do something that might seem strange to you. We get back up and try again, usually in a completely different way. Zixtal's crystalline form had stilled completely. This is irrelevant. Progress comes through perfection, not failure, does it? Sarah stepped forward, her confidence growing. In preparing for this meeting, we analyzed the technological development curves of every council species. They're all remarkably similar, steady, predictable, each step following logically from the last. But look at humanity's development curve. She activated another hologram, showing a chaotic line that jumped erratically, sometimes doubling back, often shooting off in unexpected directions. We don't just think outside the box, High Counselor. Half the time, we don't even realize there is a box. This is precisely why you must be contained, the Silicon Collective representative interjected. Such chaos led us to develop 47 different music notation systems, Professor Okonjo interrupted. 17 major approaches to medicine, over 100 distinct mathematical notations. And yes, some were dead ends. Many failed. But each failure taught us something new, showed us a different way to look at the problem. Sarah pulled up another hologram, this one showing the first human FTL drive. Your species discovered faster than light travel through careful quantum manipulation. We discovered it because Dr. Rita Patel was trying to develop a better coffee maker and accidentally created a localized space-time distortion in her laboratory's break room. A ripple of something new passed through the council chamber, not quite understanding, not quite acceptance, but perhaps the first stirring of doubt in their certainties. We propose this, Sarah said, her voice strong and clear. Give us 1 year. Let Professor Okonjo establish a small teaching program. Let us show you what humanity's greatest gift to the galaxy could be. Not our technology, not our resources, but our ability to fail productively, to think in ways that might seem illogical to you, to find solutions where others see only chaos. Zixtal was silent for a long moment, their crystalline form shifting through various colors as they processed this unprecedented situation. Finally, they spoke. And if we reject this proposal, then we'll fail at convincing you, Sarah replied with a smile. And we'll learn from that too, and try something else. Because that's what humans do. The chamber erupted in discussion, arguments and counter-arguments flying in 100 different languages. But Sarah stood her ground, Professor Okonjo's hologram beside her, both of them wearing the same quiet, confident smile. They had already succeeded in the first lesson, making the council question its own perfection. And that was just the beginning. The teacher's gambit. Professor Okonjo surveyed his first class of alien students with poorly concealed delight. The teaching space provided by the council was, like everything else in their facilities, a monument to precision. A perfect hemisphere with acoustics so refined that a whisper from any point could be heard with equal clarity throughout the room. The students themselves were no less perfect. 3 crystalline beings from the Silicon Collective, 2 energy state entities contained in quantum matrices, and a single representative from the biomechanical Syntharch Concordat. Welcome, he said, setting down an old, battered leather briefcase that drew confused stares from his pupils. Today's lesson will begin with a failure. The Syntharch representative, whose name was an algorithmic sequence that human tongues couldn't pronounce, raised a mechanical appendage. Clarification requested. How can a lesson begin with failure? That contradicts the definition of education. Does it? Okonjo pulled a piece of chalk from his briefcase. The aliens watched in bewilderment as he approached the room's pristine, smart surface wall. Your pardon, but I prefer older tools for this demonstration. The chalk scratched against the wall, leaving imperfect white marks that made the Silicon Collective students vibrate in distress. Okonjo drew a simple stick figure at the bottom of a cliff face. This is humanity, about 300,000 years ago. We wanted to reach the top of the cliff. He drew an X at the cliff's peak. We tried climbing. He drew several falling stick figures. We failed. Many died. But with each failure, he began drawing a series of crude tools, ropes, wooden structures, primitive elevators. Inefficient, one of the energy beings pulsed. The optimal solution would be to calculate the exact requirements first, then implement them. Ah, but we didn't know what was possible, Okonjo replied, continuing to draw. We didn't even know what we didn't know. Each failure taught us something new about physics, about materials, about our own limitations. And sometimes, he drew a stick figure with crude wings. Sometimes we failed so spectacularly that it led us to imagine entirely new possibilities. The synth-arch raised its appendage again. Query: are you suggesting that inefficiency is preferable to optimization? Not at all. I'm suggesting that without learning to fail, we never would have learned to fly. Okonjo turned to face his class. Today's assignment is simple. I want each of you to fail at something. The silence that followed was profound. The Silicon Collective representatives' crystalline forms clouded with confusion. The energy beings flickered erratically. The synth-arch's behavioral algorithms seemed caught in a loop. Impossible, one of the crystal beings finally chimed. Our actions are calculated to prevent failure. It would be necessary to deliberately introduce errors, which would be irrational. Exactly. Okonjo's face lit up. You're going to introduce deliberate errors into your processes. You're going to do things wrong, not to achieve failure, but to understand how and why they fail. The synth-arch's voice emerged, heavily modulated. This is madness. The Council cannot have approved this methodology. Oh, but they did. Dr. Sarah Chen's voice came from the doorway, where she stood with High Counselor Zixtal. In fact, the High Counselor has agreed to participate in today's lesson. The students' shock was palpable as Zixtal entered the room. The crystalline leader's form was immaculate as always, but there was something different in their bearing. A slight uncertainty that none of their kind had shown before. I have observed, Zixtal announced, that human progress often defies our predictive models. Perhaps there is value in understanding their methods. They turned to Okonjo. I will attempt your exercise in failure. Okonjo's smile widened as he reached into his briefcase again. Excellent. We'll start with something simple. He pulled out a child's toy, a bicycle with training wheels. This is how human children learn balance. The next hour was unlike anything the council chambers had ever witnessed. The mighty High Counselor of the Galactic Council, along with the other students, attempted to master the simple human conveyance. They failed, repeatedly, spectacularly. The Silicon Collective representatives developed hairline stress fractures from impacts. The energy beings repeatedly overcompensated and sent their quantum matrices spinning. The synth-arch's predictive algorithms proved worse than useless at maintaining balance. But something else happened too. They began to adapt, not through calculation or optimization, but through what humans had relied on for millennia: trial and error, intuition, and the gradual development of muscle memory, or their equivalent systems. Remarkable, Zixtal said at last, managing to stay upright on the bicycle for a full 10 seconds. The process of failure contains data that cannot be predicted theoretically. And how do you feel? Okonjo asked. The High Counselor was silent for a moment. I feel uncertain, unstable. Another pause. But I also feel as though I understand something new, not just about balance, but about learning itself. That, Sarah said softly, is exactly what we hoped you'd say. There is more, Zixtal continued, their crystalline form shifting through thoughtful patterns. In reviewing the data from my failures, I noticed that each attempt was unique. Even when applying the same corrections, the outcomes varied. This contradicts our fundamental assumptions about educational efficiency. Okonjo nodded. Welcome to the beautiful chaos of real learning, High Counselor. This was just lesson 1. As the class concluded, the students filed out, their perfect postures slightly altered, their certainties just a bit less certain. Sarah watched them go, then turned to Okonjo. "They're already changing," she said. "The question is, are they ready for tomorrow's lesson?" Okonjo packed away the chalk and smiled. "Oh, tomorrow is when it gets really interesting. Tomorrow, we teach them about imagination." The bicycle stood in the center of the perfect hemispherical room, a symbol of imperfect progress, its slightly scratched surface catching the light like a promise of things to come. The spark of imagination. The council's emergency session was called 3 days after Professor Okonjo introduced his students to finger painting. High Counselor Zixtal, their crystalline form still bearing traces of purple pigment, faced the assembled representatives with what could only be described as embarrassment. "The human teaching methods are causing unprecedented disruptions," they announced. This morning, a member of the Silicon Collective attempted to improvise during a quantum calculation. The resulting anomaly temporarily reversed the flow of time in 3 corridors. Dr. Chen stood at the podium below, fighting to keep her expression neutral. Beside her, Professor Okonjo didn't even try to hide his grin. "With respect, High Counselor," Sarah said, "that's actually impressive progress. Creative application of quantum mechanics is exactly what we." A SynthArt student has begun producing what they call poetry in their status reports. Zixtal continued, their tone suggesting they were discussing a particularly virulent disease. "And 2 of our energy state beings spent 3 hours attempting to determine what clouds look like, despite the fact that clouds clearly look like collections of suspended water droplets and ice crystals." "Ah," Okonjo stepped forward. "But what else do they look like?" The chamber fell silent. Finally, one of the junior counselors, a being of pure mathematical equations, spoke up. "Clouds look like clouds. The question is illogical." "Really?" Okonjo activated a holographic display, showing Earth's sky. "Because humans have seen dragons in clouds, and ships, and faces, and dancing animals. We've seen entire stories written in the random patterns of water vapor. And that ability, to see patterns where none exist, to imagine possibilities beyond the immediate reality, that's part of what makes us unique. It makes you unstable," another counselor argued. "These teachings are introducing chaos into our perfect systems." "Perfect systems," Sarah echoed, her voice carrying a hint of challenge. "And yet, when we arrived here, you had no art galleries, no music halls, no theaters. Your architecture, while mathematically precise, all looks identical. Don't you ever wonder what else might be possible?" The chamber erupted in overlapping arguments. Zixtal raised their appendages for silence, but for the first time in council history, the gesture wasn't immediately obeyed. Small groups of representatives had broken off into heated discussions. One Silicon Collective member was attempting to explain to others why they had started arranging their morning nutrient crystals into patterns just to see what would happen. "Order." Zixtal's voice carried a note of desperation. "We must maintain order." "Why?" The simple question came from an unexpected source. The SynthArt representative, who had been writing poetry, stood up, their mechanical form whirring softly. "Query. If order has brought us to the apex of technological achievement, why do these humans, these chaotic, imperfect beings, continue to surprise us? They achieve breakthroughs through accidents. They solve problems through imagination. Their very presence here defies our predictive models." Professor Okonjo stepped forward, pulling something from his briefcase. It was a simple piece of paper, folded into the shape of a crane. "Yesterday," he said, "I taught my class about origami. The Silicon Collective students were fascinated by how a flat surface could become 3-dimensional through nothing more than folds. The energy beings spent hours contemplating the transformation of potential into form. And our SynthArt friend here," he gestured to the poetic representative, "discovered that the same pattern could create different results based on minute variations in technique. But here's what truly amazed them," Sarah added. When we explained that a human child named Sadako Sasaki once believed that folding 1,000 paper cranes could grant a wish, they didn't dismiss it as illogical. Instead, they asked what it meant to wish for something that might be impossible. They began to understand the power of hope, of symbolism, of meaning beyond pure function. The chamber had grown quiet again, but it was a different kind of quiet. Not the usual perfect silence of the council, but a silence full of unasked questions and unexplored possibilities. "Show us," someone said. Then more voices joined in. "Show us more." Professor Okanjo smiled and began distributing sheets of paper. "The first step," he said, "is to forget everything you know about geometric perfection. Today, we're going to create something that has never existed before." As the council members awkwardly attempted their first folds, Sarah noticed something extraordinary. The perfect angles of the chamber's architecture seemed to shift slightly, as if the very building was trying to imagine new forms. The crystalline surfaces that always displayed perfect mathematical patterns began showing slight variations, tiny imperfections that somehow made them more beautiful. "It's spreading," she whispered to Okanjo. "They're beginning to understand that perfection isn't the only path to progress." "Indeed," he replied, watching as High Counselor Zixtel struggled to create their first paper crane, their crystalline form reflecting a rainbow of uncertain emotions. "But tomorrow's lesson will be the real challenge." "Oh, what are you planning?" "Tomorrow," he said with a twinkle in his eye, "we teach them about music. Not the mathematical harmonies they've always known, but jazz." Across the chamber, 1,000 paper cranes were taking shape, each one slightly different, each one perfectly imperfect. And in those differences, in those small defeats of precision, something new was being born, the first stirrings of creativity in a civilization that had forgotten how to dream. The coming storm. The alert came during Professor Okanjo's jazz improvisation class, interrupting a rather interesting attempt by the energy beings to understand the concept of playing by feel. The council chamber's perfect walls pulsed with urgent warning patterns, and High Counselor Zixtel's crystalline form darkened with concern. "A Class 9 quantum anomaly has been detected in the Carina sector," they announced, their voice stripped of its usual mathematical precision. "Our models predict total system collapse within 72 hours. The chamber's display filled with data streams that would have taken human scientists years to comprehend. But Sarah Chen noticed something odd about the patterns. "Those energy signatures," she said, pointing to a particular sequence. "They look almost like jazz." Professor Okanjo finished, stepping closer to the display. "The quantum fluctuations, they're not random. They're syncopated." The council members stared at them in confusion. The synth art representative who had taken to poetry tilted their mechanical head. Clarification required. "How can a quantum anomaly resemble a musical form?" "Because," Sarah explained, "what you're seeing isn't chaos. It's improvisation. The quantum field is playing." High Counselor Zixtel's form flickered with dismissal. "Impossible. Quantum mechanics follow strict mathematical principles. They cannot play." "Can't they?" Okanjo pulled up the data from their recent classes. "Look at what happened when your students began experimenting with quantum calculations. The anomalies they created didn't follow your predicted patterns, but they weren't truly random either. They showed creativity." A murmur ran through the chamber as the implications sank in. One of the Silicon Collective students stepped forward, their crystalline form vibrating with excitement. "The quantum field, it learned from us. From our experiments. We taught it to improvise. And now it's gone rogue." Sarah added, "Your traditional containment methods won't work because they're based on predictable patterns. You can't fight jazz with mathematics." "Then we are doomed," Zixtel stated flatly. "If we cannot predict its behavior, we cannot control it." "Who said anything about control?" Okanjo's eyes twinkled. "Sometimes, High Counselor, the solution isn't to impose order on chaos. Sometimes, you have to join the dance." The chamber erupted in overlapping arguments. The energy beings pulsed with agitation. The Silicon Collective representatives chimed in discordant patterns, and the Syntharch's cognitive matrices whirred with calculations seeking logical solutions where none existed. Silence. Sarah's voice cut through the chaos. Professor Okonjo is right. We've been teaching you about human creativity and improvisation. Now it's time to put those lessons to the test. She turned to the main display, where the quantum anomalies' jazz-like patterns swirled and shifted. We need a quantum jam session. The next 48 hours transformed the Council's perfect chamber into something unprecedented. Under Okonjo's guidance, the energy beings learned to modulate their quantum states in rhythmic patterns. The Silicon Collective members discovered they could create harmonic resonances through precise vibrations of their crystalline forms. Even the Syntharch representatives began generating algorithmic sequences that somehow captured the spirit of bebop. High Counselor Zixtal watched with a mixture of horror and fascination as their ordered universe descended into what could only be described as the galaxy's first quantum jazz concert. "The anomaly is responding," Sarah announced, monitoring the data streams. "It's matching our patterns, creating counterpoints, engaging in call and response." "But how do we stop it?" Zixtal demanded. "We don't," Okonjo replied. "We guide it. Like any good jazz musician, we help it find its way back to the main theme." He turned to the assembled beings. "Everyone together now. Let's bring it home." What followed defied description in any known language. The combined quantum harmonics of 1,000 alien species, improvising together for the first time in galactic history, reached out across space to engage with the anomaly. The energy beings swooped and swirled in complex patterns. The Silicon Collective vibrated in crystalline choruses. The Syntharch wove mathematical poetry through the quantum foam. And slowly, gradually, the anomaly began to stabilize, not through forced containment, but through harmony. It found its place in the greater composition of spacetime, its wild improvisations settling into a sustainable rhythm. As the crisis subsided, the council chamber fell quiet, but it was a different kind of quiet than before. The perfect walls now bore traces of the quantum jazz performance, subtle patterns that would never quite return to their original state of mathematical precision. "I believe," High Counselor Zixtal said slowly, their crystalline form shimmering with new understanding, "that we owe humanity more than we realized. We thought we were testing you, but you have been teaching us all along." Sarah smiled. "The lesson isn't over yet, High Counselor. This was just the first movement." Professor Okonjo nodded, already pulling out his briefcase. "Indeed. Now that you've learned to improvise with quantum mechanics, wait until you see what happens when we introduce you to human dance." The chamber's perfect surfaces seemed to quiver in anticipation, as if the very fabric of council space was ready to learn new rhythms. The age of perfect precision was ending, and something far more interesting was about to begin. A new symphony. 1 year after the quantum jazz crisis, the Grand Assembly Hall of the Galactic Council was unrecognizable. The once perfect surfaces now rippled with subtle variations, like waves on a cosmic ocean. Artwork from 100 species decorated the walls, some mathematical, some abstract, some defying classification altogether. And in the center of it all stood Professor James Okonjo and Dr. Sarah Chen, preparing to deliver their final assessment. "When we first arrived," Sarah began, "you judged humanity by your standards of perfection. Today, we ask you to judge yourselves by new standards, not of what you can calculate, but of what you can imagine." The assembled council members shifted in their seats, their forms reflecting a year's worth of change. The Silicon Collective representatives now wore their stress fractures like badges of honor, each imperfection telling the story of a lesson learned. The energy beings pulsed with complex rhythms they had discovered through dance. The Syntharch's mechanical forms had been modified with what they insisted were aesthetic improvements, though no one quite understood why they needed racing stripes. Professor Okonjo stepped forward, his well-worn briefcase in hand. "Our year of teaching has concluded, but your education is just beginning. Show them, High Counselor. Zixtal rose, their crystalline form now permanently altered by the quantum jazz experience. Where once they had reflected pure light in calculated patterns, they now created shifting auroras of color that somehow expressed emotion. I have prepared, they announced, what humans call a presentation. The chamber's displays came to life, but instead of the usual data streams, they showed a series of images. A Silicon Collective Youth Center where children were encouraged to form imperfect crystalline structures. An energy being art gallery where quantum states were manipulated to create ephemeral sculptures. A SynthArch programming academy that taught the value of elegant kludges alongside optimal solutions. In 1 year, Zixtal continued, their voice carrying unusual warmth, we have experienced more rapid development than in the previous millennium. Not in technology or efficiency. In those areas, we were already advanced. No, we have grown in ways we never knew were possible. The displays shifted to show more images. The first alien stand-up comedy club, a zero-gravity ballet performed by beings of pure mathematics, a museum dedicated to beautiful mistakes that had become the most visited site in council space. We thought we were perfect, Zixtal said. We were perfectly stagnant. Through humanity's lessons, we have learned that true growth comes not from avoiding failure, but from embracing the possibility of it. Not from following established patterns, but from daring to create new ones. Sarah felt tears in her eyes as she watched the council members nod in agreement. Even the most conservative among them had been transformed by the year's experiences. And so, Zixtal announced, their form blazing with colors that somehow conveyed both joy and solemnity, the council has reached a decision. Humanity will not be judged by our standards. They paused. Instead, we asked to be judged by yours. The chamber erupted in something that had never been heard before in council space. Applause. Not the polite acknowledgement of mathematical achievement, but the genuine, spontaneous expression of joy and appreciation that humans had perfected over millennia. Professor Okonjo opened his briefcase one last time. Then let us give you our judgment. He pulled out a simple certificate, hand-drawn rather than printed. The Galactic Council has earned what humans call a passing grade. But more importantly, you've learned the most valuable lesson we could teach. There is no final exam in creativity. The learning never ends. And that, Sarah added, is why we'd like to propose a new arrangement. Earth will gladly join the Galactic Council, not as students or teachers, but as partners in exploration. There are infinite possibilities in this universe, and we've only just begun to imagine them together. The Chamber's response was immediate and unprecedented. The Silicon Collective burst into crystalline songs of their own composition. The energy beings performed an impromptu quantum dance. The SynthArch initiated what they called a group hug protocol that nearly crashed their behavioral matrices. High Counselor Zixtal raised their appendages, not for silence this time, but to join in the celebration. Then let this mark not an ending, but a beginning. The age of perfect precision is over. The age of beautiful imperfection has begun. As the celebration continued, Professor Okonjo leaned over to Sarah. You know what this means, don't you? She smiled. That we fundamentally altered the course of galactic civilization. No, he replied, pulling out a jazz record from his seemingly bottomless briefcase. It means we need to start planning the curriculum for next year. I'm thinking we start with abstract expressionism and work our way up to interpretive dance. Above them, the chamber's perfect dome had begun to change, its surface rippling with new patterns, new possibilities, new dreams. The first lesson was complete, but the teaching and learning would go on forever. In the hearts and minds of 1,000 alien species, a simple truth had taken root. Perfection wasn't an endpoint, but a journey, and the most beautiful paths were often the ones that wandered far from the straight and narrow.